Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 963 for July 31st, 2022. Coming up in a few minutes.
There were boundaries, but we could push those boundaries and do things that were within the letter of the law that nobody had tried before.
Bill Ashburn celebrated his 35th year in the whiskey business this week. He's the master blender for 40 Creek Canadian Whisky and normally likes to stay behind the scenes. That is starting to change, though, and that's a good thing for those of us who love whiskey. I'll talk with Bill Ashburn later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. We'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, your voice, behind the label, and...
As you look at what American whiskey has gone through in the last 20 years, it's kind of a renaissance of bourbon volumes, really, really growing, and then rye, becoming its own category. Obviously, it was a formal category, but having that scale that American whiskey meant more than just bourbon. And, I like to think that American Single Malt is on that similar trajectory.
The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
Gabriel Cardarella here with Dewar's Whiskey, inviting you to enjoy this episode of WhiskyCast with a glass of Dewar's, the most awarded blended Scotch whiskey in history.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast. Robin Redbreast? You may have seen me around. Face label, label face. Yeah, that's the one. I'm now contractually obligated to be their spokesbird. Yeah, my agent didn't read the small print. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. After years of lobbying, the makers of American Single Malt whiskey are a step closer to getting an official definition for their whiskeys in U.S. regulations. Friday, the Treasury Department's Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau published its proposed standard of identity for American single malts and kicked off a 60-day public comment period on the proposal. It's a simple framework. To qualify, a whiskey has to come from a single distillery and be mashed, distilled, and matured in the United States with 100% malted barley, distilled no higher than 80% ABV, or 160 proof, matured in oak containers no larger than 700 liters, and bottled at least 40% ABV, or 80 proof. Matt Hoffman of Seattle's Westland Distillery is one of the founders of the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission and petitioned the TTB in 2017 to create the standard.
The proposed rulemaking is exactly, to the best of my understanding, what we as the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission came up with. So that is, for me, the first really big win. The second big thing is it looks like there's an accelerated public comment period of 60 days, if I'm reading it correctly. So, yeah, it's just, it seems like we've got everything kind of ready to go for this final act here. And then hopefully, we could have this thing done by the end of the year.
They cited Westland specifically in the as one of the petitioners who got this whole ball rolling 5 years ago. Did you think it would take 5 years to get it done?
No, definitely not. It's kind of, you don't really know what these things, you just kind of have to set out and do it. And it's been 6 years actually. So it's been even longer than that. So, I mean, you just kind of have to put one step in front of the other. And the upside of the fact that we have been doing this for 6 years is that we've been able to really gather, the industry consensus. There's more than or nearly 200 distilleries. I think we're on board in the U.S. with this definition. More join every day, big distilleries, small distilleries. So we're really able to kind of work out, the kinks of the proposal and really talk people through it. So I think that is going to help. Maybe this is just me with Stockholm Syndrome, but help get this thing through at the end once we get through the public comment period.
Around 200 distilleries have signed on to support the Single Malt Commission's proposed standard, which is largely based on existing laws in Scotland governing single malt production there. There are a few exceptions. Distillers can use either pot stills or column stills, and there's a provision that would allow for small amounts of flavorings and colorings, that is consistent with other styles of American whiskeys, except for those labeled as straight whiskeys. Gareth Moore of the Virginia Distillery Company is another commission co-founder and told me that it was important to respect the global precedents while still allowing for innovation.
Around the world, the standard has kind of been already set for us by Scotland, Ireland, Japan, and so on, that when they say single malt, they're not talking about malted rye, they're not talking about malted quinoa or malted whatever you can malt. They're talking about malted barley. And so since that expectation has already been set globally, but not by us, but by other countries, having American single malt match that global definition means that consumers can say, hey, this is really an American single malt, just like you would see in Scotland, or just like you would see coming out of Ireland or Japan or many, many other parts of the world.
Even without an official definition, American single malt distillers have been betting on this for several years now. Steve Hawley is the president of the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission.
American single malt is already outpacing a lot of other categories in growth, and I think this is only going to serve to fuel that even more. I think you'll see a lot more people get into single malt production in America, and I think you'll see a lot more exporting of single malt now that there's a standard of identity in place that will not only mean something here, but it's important to remember that this also allows us to have real conversations with export markets and get some reciprocity there as well. So I really do think we're still just at the beginning of a huge wave for American single malt, and the next couple decades are going to be exciting.
The public comment period runs through September 27th, and anyone can submit comments supporting the proposal or suggesting changes. We've already seen social media criticisms on things like the lack of a minimum age requirement. We'll have some of those comments later on Your Voice. In other news, Beam Suntory is planning to invest $400 million to expand production at its Booker Noe Distillery in Boston, Kentucky, just down the road from the flagship Jim Beam Distillery in Claremont. That's the showplace and home of the Jim Beam Visitors Center, but the distillery named for the late Booker Noe is the backbone of the company's Kentucky distilling empire. It produces most of the whiskey that goes into the various Beam brands. The announcement of the expansion did not come from Beam. In fact, the company has not yet responded to our requests for interviews or more information. The announcement came from Governor Andy Beshear's office. Beam received a multi-million-dollar package of tax incentives from the state for the expansion. Another expansion to note, this one out of Scotland. Brown-Forman plans to invest £30 million over the next 3 years to expand production at Glendronach Distillery. It's the second major investment at the distillery following Visitors Center renovations 2 years ago, and will more than double Glendronach's annual production while also improving energy efficiency. The Gallo family is expanding into the bourbon business. The family's Spirit of Gallo division has made a strategic investment in Horse Soldier Bourbon and will take on distribution for the brand. It's available now in 17 U.S. states, and the partnership will allow for a gradual expansion nationwide. It's been 9 years since the Balvenie last introduced a new whiskey in its cask finishes range. Now, maltmaster David Stewart has created a 16-year-old French oak single malt to join the range, which includes the 12-year-old Doublewood, the 21-year-old Portwood, and the most recent release until now, the 14-year-old Caribbean cask. It's available in the U.S. with a recommended retail price of $175 a bottle. White & Mackay's Fettercairn Distillery is also releasing a new version of its 16-year-old single malt. It's the third in an annual series of releases that began in 2020. This year's version was matured in first fill Oloroso sherry casks, then finished in first fill PX sherry casks, followed by a final finishing period in ex-bourbon barrels. It's available now in the UK and Europe with a recommended retail price of £72 a bottle. There are plans for distribution in Asia and global travel retail next year. The start of August means the start of Edinburgh's annual festival, which returns this year after being canceled the last 2 years because of the pandemic. Cask 88 is trying for a unique honor during the festival, the title of the world's smallest whiskey bar. It'll be in a former Edinburgh police call box on Princes Street, with room for one bartender and one customer. Since the space is so limited, you won't have a lot of time to enjoy a dram, just 15 minutes per person per day. Needless to say, advance reservations are required. At least the drams are free, albeit sample-sized. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com and on our social media timelines. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast.
Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events, brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling. Whiskey Life Perth is this coming weekend in Perth, Australia. Swig and Savor is on the 12th in Portland, Oregon. The Edinburgh Whiskey Fringe is the weekend of the 12th through the 14th in Edinburgh, Scotland. Bourbon's Bistro in Louisville, Kentucky hosts an Angel's Envy Bourbon Dinner August 17th. McTeers has its next whiskey auction on the 19th in Glasgow, Scotland. That same night is the Los Angeles Magazine Whiskey Festival in L.A. Westport Whiskey and Wine hosts a Bourbon Plus magazine live and online tasting with Fred Noe August 31st. And September starts off with Whiskey Live in Adelaide, Australia, the first weekend of the month. Our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com lets you look for events in your area or wherever you may be traveling. It's brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of the Virginia Rye Whiskey. You'll find their Roundstone Rye at fine whiskey shops in 26 U.S. states, 3 continents, and online. Visit the new BuyVirginiaRye.com site for more details, and please drink responsibly.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast. Kentucky and Ireland have plenty in common. 2 homes of horse racing. Bluegrass music is said to have Irish roots. Okay, it's not the longest list, but the Redbreast Kentucky Oak Edition only strengthens the bond. Finished in sustainably sourced Kentucky oak for a captivating nose and round taste. I see a triple crown in this thoroughbred's future.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlock and the Classic Malts lineup. 30 years ago, John Hall bought a small distillery in Grimsby, Ontario, and teamed up with the distillery's blender, Bill Ashburn. A few years later, they released the first bottles of 40 Creek Barrel Select, and together, they reshaped the world of Canadian whisky. John left 8 years ago after selling 40 Creek to Campari, but Bill Ashburn is still making 40 Creek's whiskies, and now he's starting to come out into the spotlight. 30 years doesn't seem like a long time, does it?
Yeah, and it's actually 35 years, which, has gone by in a blink of an eye, shall we say.
I thought it was 1992 when you and John started things.
Well, I guess you're correct. 1992 is when John came on board, but I actually predated John here. I was with the old Reeder Distillery when John made the purchase and acquired 40 Creek.
Okay, I did not realize that.
Yeah, so actually this Wednesday is actually 35 years for me in this building, working on blends of various things for all those years.
So how'd you get started 35 years ago?
So I was actually in the wine industry for 7 years prior to that. And the winery that I was working for was sold due to some different various reasons. And it was sold to a large competitor. And you know how it is when you're in industry and you have competitors and it's kind of difficult to change your mindset and suddenly start working for a competitor. So I decided that I wanted to stay in the alcoholic beverage business, but not necessarily in the wine business. The wine business can be very intense at a very short period of time, called vintage every year. And I went looking for something else and found it in Reeder Distillery.
And Reeder becomes Kittling Ridge, which eventually becomes 40 Creek, right?
Yeah, that is the chain of thought. I started working for Reeder Distillery when Otto Reeder still owned the company. I was very fortunate to not only work with Otto Reeder, but also to work with Gerhard Kohn, who was the master distiller general manager at the time. So it was a really intense 5 years of learning a new industry, because even though the wine industry has a lot of similarities, there's a lot of differences and nuances that you need to learn. And I was fortunate to have two very strong industry-based people to show me the ropes, shall we say.
Are they the ones who taught you how to blend whiskey?
Blending whiskey is very similar to blending other alcoholic beverages. And I think the skills are transferable. It's having the ability to taste and the ability to, in your mind, figure out how things are going to work together. That's really important. And that was kind of my role in the wine industry as well. So I got to learn the basics from them. The thing that they really lacked were both the marketing skills and the vision. And John, without a doubt, was and still is a visionary in the industry. And his marketing skills are second to none.
And once he came on board in 92, things just took off once you started releasing that first whiskey in 2000.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. You know, we spent 8 years trying to stabilize the company, trying to plan blends, and basically keep everything afloat. That's why we started manufacturing wines here as Kittling Ridge. And it was always the plan to use the wine to bring in cash flow to allow us to do what we really wanted to do, which was essentially upend the Canadian whiskey industry.
Tell me about those early days of upending Canadian whiskey, because you certainly did that.
Well, you know, you have to think back to that time frame when all the large distilleries, which was all there was left in Canada, when all the large distilleries were essentially just maintaining the products they had. They weren't doing any innovation. They were just putting out whiskeys like they always had. They were closing distilleries. So the industry was actually contracting a little bit. So for John to say, we're going to get into this category that's essentially dying, and we're going to do something. He saw an opportunity that nobody else saw, and he deserves 100% of the credit for that.
But you were the one who was actually making the whiskeys, and we never really heard about that part when John was running the show. You were sort of working in the shadows.
Yeah, and for me, that was actually ideal at the time. I got to do my thing in the background, making blends, improving my blending skills, because even though there were similarities in what I was doing in the wine industry, spirits are a little bit different. You need to start to learn what stocks you have, what stocks you don't have, where can you get them, what do we need to get. So there was a whole learning process. So I was able to just operate in the background, do my thing, bring blends to John and say, hey, do you like this? Don't you like this? Is this the right direction? So it was a collaborative approach in the background, but I got to do it without all of the things involved of being the face of the brand.
And the travel.
And the travel. Oh, you must have heard that I'm not really big on traveling.
Yeah, we've heard that. As I noted before, the last time I saw you was at the 2019 Canadian Whisky Awards, and I think that was the first time they'd pried you out of Grimsby ever on behalf of the brand.
Not quite the first time, but pretty close. I think I'm becoming more comfortable with it as I go along. You have to remember, for years I was also running completely the distillery and the distribution and everything else. So I had a pretty big, really wide-ranging portfolio of what I was doing. We've matured as a company quite a bit since then, and we have a lot more people in place, and I'm a lot more comfortable with leaving the facility, shall we say. I've actually done more traveling this year than I think I've done virtually my entire time here.
That's great, because it's good to see you get out and about and get some of the credit that you deserve, because you have made some really good whiskeys over the years. What sets 40 Creek apart from other Canadian whiskeys?
I think what set us apart is we entered into the Canadian whisky category knowing there were guidelines, there were boundaries, but we could push those boundaries and do things that were within the letter of the law that nobody had tried before. And I think that experimentation really has paid off for us over the years, being willing to try things that are new. And, I'm not going to say that nobody's tried before, but nobody's tried within the Canadian whisky category.
One of those was Confederation Oak, which was named Canadian Whisky of the Decade in the Canadian Whisky Awards a couple of years ago. That was a challenge, trying to find enough Canadian oak to make barrels with, right?
It definitely was. It was also a challenge to the people that make the Canadian oak barrels. They were quite entrenched in the wine industry, but to give them specifications to make a spirit barrel was different for them. And they were willing to work with us. And the product that we came out with has been a long-term success for us. I think it shows what we're capable of doing. And it's an all-round great whiskey.
Over the years, the Canadian whiskey industry has just sort of exploded from those early days when as you point out, there were just a few major distilleries. What's been your take on the growth in Canadian whiskey over the last 20 years or so?
I think it's absolutely fantastic. We're getting a lot of craft distillers in. We're getting people trying things that are novel and unique in the Canadian whisky category. I'm one person. I can't come up with every new and novel idea. Some of the things that are being done with peated Canadian whiskeys, with, it blows my mind what people are doing. And quite frankly, in some instances, I'm a little bit jealous about some of the things that they've been tried because I didn't think of it.
Such as?
So, the latest one from Mark Anthony, where they infused wild harvested mushrooms, it just intrigues me. And when you really think about it, the flavors of mushrooms are very much in that earthy category that whiskey is. And it brings it to more local. And it's just a really intriguing thing to me.
Was that a Bareface release?
It was.
Because we'll be talking with Andres Faustinelli next week, and I was just curious about that because I'd heard about this mushroom-infused whiskey but have not had a chance to try it yet.
You need to try it when you get an opportunity. And, you know, some of our small craft distilleries that are using extremely small wood barrels, shall we say, you know, they're getting the advantage of having a 4-year-old whiskey that tastes like a 12 or a 14-year-old whiskey.
They just don't have a lot of it.
They don't have a lot, but you know what? Sometimes having things in limited supply is actually a benefit, and things can always be scaled up. You know, we've done some extremely limited releases over the years. The 22-year-old rye is a prime example of that. Sometimes you can put more care and attention into those extremely limited releases than you can into the larger releases. It doesn't mean we neglect the larger releases, but you have to make sure when you're doing a larger release, especially a general release, that you can reproduce that liquid time after time after time. One of my biggest challenges throughout the years is maintaining that taste profile and continuity on blends like Barrel Select for the last 22 years. And we sometimes forget that people do expect their bottle of whiskey that they buy today to taste the same as the one they bought 5 years ago.
And Barrel Select has been one that I have recommended a number of times over the years. I once saw somebody at a liquor store and they were looking at Canadian whiskies, and I said, try that one. Here's my card. If you don't like it, let me know and I'll buy it from you. And I never heard from them.
I'm glad to hear that. It's a whiskey that I'm extremely proud of. It was one of the first 2 products we released in the year 2000. I can remember back when we developed the product and we did an internal tasting here, which was a competitive tasting against other brands at the time. And John made me redo the tasting 5 days later because he didn't believe the results. He figured I had to have fudged these results because Barrel Select and 3-grain whiskey outscored all of the other competitive whiskeys that we had on this tasting. So he actually wanted to pour the whiskeys himself to make sure I wasn't contaminating the tasting, shall we say.
He didn't trust you?
Well, he trusted me, but he didn't trust the results because the results were so skewed towards the Barrel Select blend. It was amazing.
Now, I've got to switch topics here because you are also a dog trainer.
Well, I'm a dog breeder and I'm a conformation handler. I wouldn't exactly call myself a dog trainer. I train dogs for a very specific purpose, which is conformation shows, which are beauty contests.
But you named your last whiskey after one of your dogs, right?
Well, Foxheart Whiskey is actually our kennel name. My wife and I breed wire fox terriers, and our registered kennel name is Foxheart.
So that's where the name came from. But what went into the whiskey?
So in the whiskey, I wanted to do something really different. And we actually added a very small portion, and it's well within the 9.09%, of 12-year-old Jamaican rum. And it brings all kinds of elements to the whiskey that are very unique. It was funny because when we first released that product, there was a big hubbub about you can't do that. You can't add rum to whiskey. They're different categories and da-da-da-da-da. And my answer always was, have you tasted it? What did you think of it? And it's been fairly slow in the build of that product, but now all the comments are positive on the taste of the liquid. And nobody's coming back and saying, you can't do that.
Explain the 9.09% rule for those who are not familiar. This is something that is unique to Canadian whiskey.
It absolutely is unique to Canadian whiskey. Under Canadian whiskey laws, you can add up to 9.09% flavoring. And flavoring is clearly defined in the Act as wine or spirits that have been aged a minimum of 2 years. It kind of has gotten a bad rap over the years because the 9.09 has been used in the past to add less expensive components to Canadian whiskey to, shall we say, stretch the quality and reduce the price. We've always taken a completely different tact on the 9.09. Virtually everything we've ever added under the 9.09 rule has been more expensive than the whiskey we're adding it to. So we feel we're increasing the variety of flavors and experiences that people can get, and we're not cheapening the product in any way, shape, or form.
So what are you planning for this year for Whiskey Weekend in September?
Well, I'm pleased to say that we're actually going to be doing an in-person whiskey weekend this year for the first time, and both 2020 and 21 were done virtually, which to me doesn't do what Whiskey Weekend was always designed to do, which was the personal interaction. You can have some interactions like we're having through the internet, but it's not the same. So we are going to be back fully in person with Whiskey Weekend. We're planning a really interesting seminar, which is going to be 40 Creek Through the Ages. We haven't quite finalized the details, but the plan is to taste through 40 Creek whiskeys from the beginning all the way up to the current 2022 limited release, which is Art of the Blend.
And we're just hearing about this one for the first time, Art of the Blend. Tell me about it.
So Art of the Blend is a combination of whiskey blending skills and a nod to our Niagara wine industry roots. We actually take a very small percentage of wine that was produced from grapes harvested in the dead of winter, made into wine, and added to the blend. It's, again, in a very small portion, but it adds top notes, aromas, and tastes that you can't get from straight whiskeys.
And this will go on sale that weekend, right?
Well, it's going to be released in the beginning of September. Through our website, etc., we've already sold, I believe it's 550 bottles through pre-reservation. And we're hoping that we're going to sell out very quickly. It's a tough act to follow from Master's Cut last year. Master's Cut sold out quicker than any limited release other than the 2007 small batch release. So it was quite something to see. And we have really high expectations, shall we say, for Art of the Blend.
The 40 Creek Whiskey Weekend will be on September 24th and 25th. It'll be the first time the distillery has been open for tours since the COVID pandemic started. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Mortlock, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlock lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit, Let's start off with a couple of American single malts. First up, the new Normandy from Whiskey Del Bac in Tucson, Arizona. It's finished in French Calvados casks and bottled at 48.5% ABV. The nose has touches of caramel apples, black cherries, creme brulee, and hints of tropical fruits. The taste has a nice balance of fruity sweetness and subtle spices, along with touches of apples mixed with tropical notes of mango and papaya. The finish is medium length with tropical fruits and a hint of caramel apples. I'm scoring the Whiskey Del Bac Normandy a 92. Now, Portland's Westward Whiskey released a single-barrel bottling for members of its Westward Club recently that has an interesting finish. It's finished in Pinot Noir rosé casks from Oregon's Dobbs Family Estate Winery. This one is bottled at 45% ABV. The nose has a good balance of fruity character and earthiness, along with red grapes, raisins, and a hint of chocolate. The taste is thick and chewy with dark fruits and a nice hit of spices, while the finish is long and spicy with lingering fruitiness and a hint of oak. I'm scoring the Westward Pinot Noir rosé finish a 92. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, our tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey, a 100-time award-winning Maryland-style rye. With a determined focus to create the best rye whiskey imaginable, Sagamore's team of distillers crafts each spirit with a nod to both tradition and innovation. Find their signature, double oak, cask strength, or reserve series of rye whiskeys, as well as their line of premium rye whiskey canned cocktails at a retailer near you. Just visit sagamorespirit.com/find-rye. Please drink responsibly. I mentioned the Craigellachie 13-year-old Baz Armagnac finish during the news earlier this month and received a sample the other day. It's finished for a year in those French oak casks and bottled at 46% ABV. The nose has touches of apple cobbler, cinnamon, pineapple, and a hint of caramel. The taste is spicy and vibrant with notes of cinnamon, caramel candies, grilled pineapple, toasted oak, and honey. The finish is long and subtle with a hint of wood smoke and red apples, and I'm scoring the Craigellachie 13-year-old Baz Armagnac finish a 93. Finally, let's look at an unusual whiskey, a bottled-in-bond single pot still whiskey from Colorado's Talnua Distillery. It's a single-barrel bottling selected in conjunction with Barry Chandler of Stories and Sips, and it's bottled, of course, at 50% ABV. The nose has touches of toasted oak, honey, subtle spices, and hints of butterscotch and peaches. The taste is thick and spicy with touches of clove, cinnamon, and black pepper, balanced by hints of lemon zest, linseed oil, apples, peaches, honey, and toasted oak. The finish is long and spicy with an underlying fruity character, and I'm scoring the Talnua Bottled in Bond Single Pot Still Whiskey a 92. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I'll be adding these whiskeys to our searchable list of more than 3,300 different whiskeys from all over the world. You can search the list by a whiskey's name, country, style, or even the score I gave it, and check it out this week at whiskycast.com.
Dewar's master blender Stephanie McLeod's innate curiosity, combined with her passion for whiskey maturation, cask finishing, and blending, has created some truly incredible expressions for Dewar's Scotch whiskey. It's also earned her 4 consecutive Master Blender of the Year titles at the International Whiskey Competition, making her the first person to achieve such an accolade. Her innovative spirit is the inspiration behind the ultra-premium Dewar's Double 32 Year, the highest-rated blended Scotch whiskey in the world with a score of 94.4. So whether you consider yourself a whiskey connoisseur or just want to find an exciting new whiskey experience, consider one of Stephanie's other masterful expressions, including Dewar's 15-year, Double 21-year, or Dewar's 8-year Mizunara cask finish, and discover just how rewarding curiosity can be. Enjoy responsibly.
Let's open up the inbox now for your voice, presented by Scarabus Islay Single Malt Scotch Whiskey. The TTB proposal on American single malts led to a lot of discussion on social media. largely over one thing the TTB left out of its proposed definition, the lack of a minimum maturation requirement. Keep in mind that existing federal regulations don't specify minimum maturation periods for anything other than straight whiskeys, and there it's just a 2-year minimum. Several people questioned the lack of a minimum age, including longtime craft distiller Ralph Arenzo, who posted this on our Facebook page. I have to agree with setting a minimum age in oak. When New York distillers agreed to a set of standards for Empire Rye, we agreed to 3 years in oak minimum. But there is disagreement on that point, even among distillers. Lenny Eckstein of Colorado's Deerhammer Distillery was one of those not as concerned. Here's what he tweeted. Are there really so many whiskeys being turned out shy of 2 years or longer? 5 to 10 years ago, maybe, but I'm having a tough time thinking of a single craft distillery that's not going at least 2 years on every expression. Remember, the other rules about requiring age statements for anything less than 4 years old would still apply. There was some concern over one thing the TTB left in. It allowed for the use of coloring, flavoring, and blending materials. At Demi Tastes tweeted this, I'm not a fan of the allowable coloring, flavoring, and blending materials yes part. If we want the category to have true integrity, we need American Single Malt on par with bourbon. Folks, take to that public comment period. And the folks at Glens Creek Distilling in Kentucky added this on Instagram. No flavoring, no coloring, no finishing. A little purity, please. I should note that the regulations allow for those additives in small amounts in every form of American whiskey except for bourbons and so-called straight whiskeys, so this is probably just for consistency, though it is worth commenting on. Longtime whiskey brand ambassador and contest judge Steve Beal tweeted this, the simpler the better. Let the American Single Malt distillers have the room to develop their own unique style. Look at the great things being done in Australia. There were lots of other comments on our social media feeds, too. A lot of them way too long to share here, but you can find them on our timelines. And if there's anything you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always get in touch with us on social media. Look for WhiskyCast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, or you can just email us, comments@whiskycast.com. Your voice is presented by Scarabus, the Islay single malt from Hunter Lang & Company that celebrates all of Isla's natural gifts in one bottle. Only those who seek shall find Scarabus. Start your search today at hunterlang.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. The TTB's proposal to create a standard of identity for American single malts sent some people searching back to answer a question. When was the last time the U.S. government created a new standard of identity for a whiskey? It appears to be 1969 when the category of light whiskey was added to the list. Now, light whiskey is not like light beer in terms of fewer calories. But back in the 60s, whiskey sales were falling under pressure from vodka brands as consumers wanted something lighter to drink. Remember when I mentioned during the news that the single malt standard of identity calls for distillation to no stronger than 80% ABV or 160 proof? Well, that's where light whiskey starts. The rules call for distillation between 80% and 95% ABV, which is as high as you can get with most stills, and it has to be stored in either used or uncharred new oak barrels. Distillers wanted to create a spirit that has the flavor of whiskey, but was lighter on the palate than traditional whiskeys. The category never really did take off in terms of sales, but light whiskey is still around today. A handful of distillers still make it, including MGP in Indiana, and it is possible to find some independent bottlings of it if you look carefully. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, And what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, cocktail recipes, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of past episodes that goes all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Small batch. How would you describe it? It's like an Irishman's understanding of baseball. Extremely limited.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Well, folks, we're nearing the end of another great episode of WhiskyCast, which means you're probably craving some whiskey. Head on over to Dewar's.com or your local retailer to discover what makes Dewar's the most awarded blended Scotch whiskey in the world.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2022, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.